The terrain of central and southern France with its forests, mountains, and shrubland were ideal for hiding. 123. The Germans could not spare thousands of men to hunt the Maquis down, and instead sent spotter planes to find them. The Maquis were careful about concealing fires and could usually avoid aerial detection. 123. The only other way of breaking up the Maquis bands was to send in a spy, which was highly dangerous work as the Maquisards would execute infiltrators. 123. Joining the men fleeing the service with the STO were others targeted by the Reich, such as Jews, Spanish Republican refugees. An Allied airman shot down over France. 124. One Maquis band in the Cévennes region consisted of German communists who had fought in the Spanish Civil War and fled to France in 1939-46. Unlike the urban resistance groups that emerged in 1940-42, who took political names such as Combat, Liberté, or Liberation, the Maquis bands chose apolitical names, such as the names of animals ours, loup, tigre, lion, puma. Rhinoceros and elephant, or people, Maquis Bernard, the Maquis Socrate, the Maquis Henry Bourgogne, or one band whose leader was a doctor, hence the name Maquis le Doc. 125. The Maquis bands that emerged in the countryside soon formed a subculture with its own slang, dress, and rules. 126. The most important Maquis rule was the so-called 24-hour rule, under which a captured Maquisard had to hold out under torture for 24 hours to give time for his comrades to escape. 127. An underground pamphlet written for young men considering joining the Maquis advised. Men who come to the Maquis to fight live badly, in precarious fashion, with food hard to find. They will be absolutely cut off from their families for the duration. The enemy does not apply the rules of war to them. They cannot be assured any pay. Every effort will be made to help their families, but it is impossible to give any guarantee in this manner. All correspondence is forbidden. Bring 2 shirts, 2 pairs of underpants, 2 pairs of woolen socks, a light sweater, a scarf, a heavy sweater, a woolen blanket, an extra pair of shoes, shoelaces, needles, thread, buttons, safety pins, soap, a canteen, a knife and fork, a torch, a compass, a weapon if possible, and also a sleeping bag if possible. Wear a warm suit, a beret, a raincoat, a good pair of hobnailed boots. 128. Another pamphlet written for the Maquis advised. A Maquisard should stay only where he can see without being seen. He should never live, eat, sleep except surrounded by lookouts. It should never be possible to take him by surprise. A Maquisard should be mobile. When a census or enlistment for the STO brings new elements he has no means of knowing into his group, he should get out. When one of the members deserts, he should get out immediately. The man could be a traitor. Réfractaires, it is not your duty to die uselessly. 126. One Maquisard recalled his first night out in the wilderness. Darkness falls in the forest. On one path some distance from our camp, 2 boys stand guard over the safety of their comrades. One has a pistol, the other a service rifle, with a few spare cartridges in a box. Their watch lasts for 2 hours. How amazing those hours on duty in the forest at night are. Noises come from everywhere, and the pale light of the moon gives everything a queer aspect. The boy looks at a small tree and thinks he sees it move. A lorry passes on a distant road. Could it be the Germans? Are they going to stop? 128. Ausby stated that the breathless prose in which this Maquisard remembered his first night out in the forest was typical of the Maquisards whose main traits were their innocence and naivety. Many seemed not to understand just precisely who they were taking on or what they were getting themselves into by fleeing to the countryside. 128. Unlike the Andarts, who were resisting Axis rule in Greece and preferred a democratic decision-making progress, the Maquis bands tended to be dominated by a charismatic leader, usually an older man who was not a réfractaire, a chef who was commonly a community leader, somebody who before the war had been a junior political or military leader under the Third Republic. or somebody who had been targeted by the Reich for political or racial reasons. 129. Regardless whether they had served in the military, the Maquis chefs soon started calling themselves capitains or colonels. 125. The aspect of life in the Maquis best remembered by veterans was their youthful idealism, with most of the Maquisards remembering how innocent they were, seeing their escape into the countryside as a grand romantic adventure, by which, as Ausby observed, they were nervously confronting new dangers they barely understood. They were proudly learning new techniques of survival and battle. These essential features stand out in accounts by Maquisards even after innocence had quickly given way to experience, which made them regard danger and discipline as commonplace. 128. The innocence of the Maquisards was reflected in the choice of names they took, which were usually whimsical and boyish names, unlike those used by the resistants in the older groups, which were always serious. 125. The Maquis had little in the way of uniforms, with the men wearing civilian clothing with a beret being the only common symbol of the Maquis, as a beret was sufficiently common in France not to be conspicuous, but uncommon enough to be the symbol of a Maquisard. 130. To support themselves, the Maquis took to theft, with bank robbery and stealing from the Chantiers de Jeunesse, the Vichy youth movement, being especially favored means of obtaining money and supplies. 131. Albert Spencer, a Canadian airman shot down over France while on a mission to drop leaflets over France who joined the Maquis, discovered the distinctive slang of the Maquisards. Learning that the leaflets he had been dropping over France were torch culls, asswipes in Maquis slang. 132. As the Maquis grew, the milice was deployed to the countryside to hunt them down, and the first militian was killed in April 1943. 110. As neither the Maquis or the milice had many guns, the casualties were low at first, and by October 1943 the milice had suffered only 10 dead. 111. The SOE made contact with the Maquis bands, but until early 1944, the SOE were unable to convince Whitehall that supplying the resistance should be a priority. 133. Until 1944, there were only 23 Halifax bombers committed to supplying resistance groups for all of Europe, and many in the SOE preferred arming resistance groups in Yugoslavia, Italy and Greece rather than French ones. 134. On 16 April 1943, the SOE agent Odette Sansom was arrested with her fellow SOE agent and lover Peter Churchill by the Abwehr captain Hugo Bleicher. 106. After her arrest, Sansom was tortured for several months, which she recounted in the 1949 book Odette, The Story of a British Agent. 106. Sansom recalled, "In those places the only thing one could try to keep was a certain dignity. There was nothing else, and one could have a little dignity and try to prove that one had a little spirit, and I suppose that kept one going. When everything else was too difficult, too bad, then one was inspired by so many things, people, perhaps a phrase one would remember that one had heard a long time before, or even a piece of poetry or a piece of music." 106. On 26 May 1943, in Paris, Moulin chaired a secret meeting attended by representatives of the main resistance groups to form the CNR, Conseil National de la Résistance, National Council of the Resistance. 108. With the National Council of the Resistance, resistance activities started to become more coordinated. In June 1943, a sabotage campaign began against the French rail system. Between June 1943 and May 1944, the resistance damaged 1,822 trains, destroyed 200 passenger cars, damaged about 1,500 passenger cars, destroyed about 2,500 freight cars, and damaged about 8,000 freight cars. 135. The resistant René Hardy had been seduced by the French Gestapo agent Lydie Bastien J.P. Fr., whose true loyalty was to her German lover, Gestapo officer Harry Stengret. Hardy was arrested on 7 June 1943 when he walked into a trap laid by Bastien. 136. After his arrest, Hardy was turned by the Gestapo as Bastian tearfully told him that she and her parents would all be sent to a concentration camp if he did not work for the Gestapo. Hardy was unaware that Bastian really loathed him and was only sleeping with him under Stengrit's orders. 136. On 9 June 1943, General de L'Estrange was arrested by the Gestapo following a tip-off provided by the double agent Hardy, and was sent to the Dachau concentration camp. 108. On 21 June 1943, Moulin called a secret meeting in Caluire-Retcuire suburb of Lyon to discuss the crisis and try to find the traitor who betrayed de L'Estrange. 108. At the meeting, Moulin and the rest were arrested by the Gestapo. 108. Moulin was brutally tortured, but never talked. 108. Moulin was beaten into a coma and died near or in the train station of Metz on 8 July 1943 as a result of brain damage. 108. Moulin was not the only resistance leader arrested in June 1943. That same month, General Aubert Freire, the leader of the Aura, was arrested and later executed. 135. In the summer of 1943, leadership of the FT Pimois was assumed by an Armenian immigrant Misak Manoukian, who becomes so famous for organizing assassinations that the FT Pimois came to be known to the French people as the group Manoukian. 47. In July 1943, the Royal Air Force attempted to bomb the Peugeot works at Sochaux, which manufactured tank turrets and engine parts for the Wehrmacht. 94. The RAF instead hit the neighborhood next to the factory, killing hundreds of French civilians. 94. To avoid a repeat, the SOE agent Harry Ray contacted industrialist Rudolph Peugeot to see if he was willing to sabotage his own factory. 94. To prove that he was working for London, Ray informed Peugeot that the BBC's French language, personal messages, service would broadcast a message containing lines from a poem that Ray had quoted that night. After hearing the poem in the broadcast, Peugeot agreed to cooperate. 94. Peugeot gave Ray the plans for the factory and suggested the best places to sabotage his factory without injuring anyone by selectively placing plastic explosives. 94. The Peugeot works were largely knocked out in a bombing organized by Ray on 5 November 1943, and output never recovered. 94. The Michelin family were approached with the same offer and declined. 94. The RAF bombed the Michelin factory at Clermont-Ferrand, France's largest tire factory and a major source of tires for the Wehrmacht, into the ground. 94. Despite the blow inflicted by arresting Moulin, by 1 October 1943, the AS had grown to 241,350 members, though most were still unarmed. 107. For the most part, the AS refrained from armed operations as it was no match for the Wehrmacht. 107. Instead, the AS forced on preparing for Jour J, D-Day, when the Allies landed in France, after which the AS would begin action. 107. In the meantime, the AS focused on training its members and conducting intelligence-gathering operations for the Allies. 107. In October 1943, Joseph Darnand, the chief of the milice who had long been frustrated at the unwillingness of the Germans to arm his force, finally won the trust of the Reich by taking a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler and being commissioned as a Waffen-SS officer together with 11 other milice leaders. 111. With that, the Germans started to arm the milice, which turned its guns on the resistance. 111. The weapons the German provided the milice with were mostly British weapons captured at Dunkirk in 1940, and as the Maquis received many weapons from the SOE. It was often the case that in the clashes between milice and the Maquis, Frenchmen fought Frenchmen with British guns and ammunition. 111. In October 1943, following a meeting between General Giraud and General de Gaulle in Algiers, orders went out for the AS and Aura to cooperate in operations against the Germans. 137. One of the most famous resistance actions took place on 11 November 1943 in the town of Oyonnax in the Jura Mountains, where about 300 Maquisards led by Henry Romanspetti arrived to celebrate the 25th anniversary of France's victory over Germany in 1918, wearing improvised uniforms. 138. There were no Germans in Oyonnax that day, and the gendarmes made no effort to oppose the resistance, who marched through the streets to lay a wreath shaped like the Cross of Lorraine at a local war memorial bearing the message, Les vainqueurs de demain, à ceux de 1418. From tomorrow's victors to those of 1418. 139. Afterwards, the people of Oyonnax joined the Maquisards in singing the French national anthem as they marched, an incident given much play on the BBC's French-language service about how one town had been liberated for a day. 120. The next month, the SS arrested 130 Oyonnax residents and sent them to the concentration camps, shot the town's doctor, and tortured and deported 2 other people, including the gendarme captain who failed to resist the Maquis on 11 November. 140. On 29 December 1943, the AS and the Communist FTP agreed to cooperate. Their actions were controlled by the COMAC, Comité Militaire d'Action Committee for Military Action, which in turn took its orders from the CNR. 137. The Communists agreed to unity largely in the belief that they would obtain more supplies from Britain, and in practice the FTP continued to work independently. 137. The SOE provided training for the resistance. However, as the SOE agent Roger Miller noted after visiting a resistance workshop making bombs in late 1943, if the instructors from the training schools in England could have seen those Frenchmen making up charges, the cellar would have looked to them like Dante's Inferno. Every conceivable school don't was being done. 82. 1944, the height of the resistance. Resistance poster showing the increase in size of the resistance and French forces since 1939. By the beginning of 1944, the BCRA was providing the Allies with 2 intelligence assessments per day based on information provided by the resistance. 48. One of the BCRA's most effective networks was headed by Colonel Ramey, who headed the Confrérie de Notre Dame, Brotherhood of Notre Dame, which provided photographs and maps of German forces in Normandy, most notably details of the Atlantic Wall. 48. In January 1944. Following extensive lobbying by the SOE, Churchill was persuaded to increase by 35 the number of planes available to drop in supplies for the Maquis. By February 1944, supply drops were up by 173%, 141. The same month, the OSS agreed to supply the Maquis with arms, 142, despite the perennial shortage of arms. By the early 1944, there were parts of rural areas in the south of France that were more under the control of the Maquis than the authorities. 143. By January 1944, a civil war had broken out with the milice and Maquis assassinating alternatively leaders of the Third Republic or collaborators, that was to become increasingly savage as 1944 went on. 144. The milice were loathed by the resistance as Frenchmen serving the occupation, and unlike the Wehrmacht and the SS, were not armed with heavy weapons nor were especially well trained, making them an enemy who could be engaged on more or less equal terms. Becoming the preferred opponent of the Maquis. 145. The men of the Wehrmacht were German conscripts whereas the milice were French volunteers. Thus explains why the resistance hated the milice so much. 145. On 10 January 1944, the milice avenged their losses at the hands of the Maquis by killing Victor Basch and his wife outside Lyon. 144. The 80-year-old Basch was a French Jew, a former president of the League for the Rights of Men, and had been a prominent Dreyfusard during the Dreyfus Affair, marking him out as an enemy of the new order in Europe by his very existence, though the elderly pacifist Basch was not actually involved in the resistance. 144. The militian who killed Bash was an anti-Semitic fanatic named Joseph Lacussen, who always kept a Star of David made of human skin taken from a Jew he killed earlier in his pocket, making him typical of the milice by this time. 144. As the resistance had not been informed of the details of Operation Overlord, many resistance leaders had developed their own plans to have the Maquis seize large parts of central and southern France, which would provide a landing area for Allied force to be known as Force C, and supplies to be brought in, allowing Force C and the Maquis to attack the Wehrmacht from the rear. 141. The supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, had rejected this plan under the grounds that the disparity between the firepower and training of the Wehrmacht versus the Maquisards meant that the resistance would be unable to hold their own in sustained combat. 141. The Maquis, unaware of this, tried to seize redoubts several times in 1944 with disastrous results. Starting in late January 1944, a group of Maquisards led by Théodose Morel, codenamed Tom, began to assemble on the Glières Plateau near Annecy in the Haute-Save. 146. By February 1944, the Maquisards numbered about 460 and had only light weapons, but received much media attention, with the Free French issuing a press release in London saying, "In Europe there are 3 countries resisting: Greece, Yugoslavia, and the Haute-Save." 146. The Vichy state sent the groups Mobiles de Réserve to evict the Maquis from the Glières Plateau and were repulsed. 146. After Morel had been killed by a French policeman during a raid, command of the Maquis des Glières was assumed by Captain Maurice Anjot. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe started to bomb the Maquisards on the Glières Plateau, and on 26 March 1944, the Germans sent in an Alpine division of 7,000 men together with various SS units and about 1,000 militians, making for about 10,000 men supported by artillery and air support, which soon overwhelmed the Maquisards, who lost about 150 killed in action and another 200 captured who were then shot. 146. Anjot knew the odds against his Maquis band were hopeless, but decided to take a stand to uphold French honor. 147. Anjot himself was one of the Maquisards killed on the Glières Plateau. 147. In February 1944, all of the resistance governments agreed to accept the authority of the Free French government based in Algiers. Until 1962, Algeria was considered to be part of France, and the resistance was renamed FFI, Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, Forces of the Interior. 137. The Germans refused to accept the resistance as legitimate opponents, and any resistant captured faced the prospect of torture and/or execution, as the Germans maintained that the Hague and Geneva Conventions did not apply to the resistance. By designating the resistance as part of the French armed forces was intended to provide the resistance with legal protection and allow the French to threaten the Germans with the possibility of prosecution for war crimes. 148. The designation did not help. For example, the Resistante Cindermans was arrested in Paris on 24 February 1944 after she was found to be carrying forged papers. 106. As she recalled, "Immediately, they handcuffed me and took me to be interrogated. Getting no reply, they slapped in the face with such force that I fell from the chair. Then they whipped me with a rubber hose, full in the face. The interrogation began at 10 o'clock in the morning and ended at 11 o'clock that night. I must tell you I had been pregnant for 3 months. 106. As part of the preparations for Operation Overlord, resistance attacks on the rail system increased with the resistance in the first 3 months of 1944, damaging 808 locomotives compared to 387 damaged by air attack. 135. Starting with the clearer weather in the spring, between April-June 1944, the resistance damaged 292 locomotives compared to 1,437 damaged in airstrikes. 135. These statistics do not completely tell the story, as resistance sabotage attacks on the rail system in the first half of 1944 were so pervasive that the Germans had to import workers from the Reichsbahn, the German state railroad, and put soldiers on trains as they no longer trusted the Chemnitz. 135 On 23 March 1944, General Pierre Koenig was appointed commander of the FFI and flew to London from Algiers to coordinate the operations of the FFI at the SHAEF, commanded by General Dwight Eisenhower, at a section known as État Major des Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, General Staff. French Forces of the Interior. 137. The American and British officers at SHAEF distrusted the resistance, with the OSS agent William J. Casey writing that many in the resistance appeared more interested in post-war politics than in fighting the Germans. 137. Despite the mistrust, SHAEF planned to use the resistance to tie down German forces. In April 1944, there were 331 drops of weapons by the SOE to the Maquis. In May, 531 drops, and in June, 866 drops. 134. The most common weapon provided by the SOE was the Sten machine gun, which, though inaccurate except at short ranges and prone to breakdown, was cheap, light, easy to assemble and disassemble, and required no special skills to use. 142. Other weapons dropped by the SOE were the Webley revolver, the Bren machine gun, the Lee Enfield rifle, and the PIAT anti-tank grenade launcher, while the OSS provided the M3 grease gun, the Browning handgun, the M1 rifle, and the bazooka anti-tank rocket launcher. 149. In general, American weaponry was preferred to British weaponry, but the British-built Bren gun emerged as one of the favorite weapons of the resistance. 142. Reflecting the importance of weapons, organizing supply drops was the main concern for the resistance in the spring of 1944. 150. André Hue, a dual citizen of France and the United Kingdom serving in the SOE, who parachuted into Brittany to lead the hillbilly resistance circuit, recalled his principal duty in the spring of 1944 was organizing supply drops and attempting to avoid the Wehrmacht and the milice. 150. Hugh had been born in Wales to a French father and a Welsh mother, and like many other Anglo-French dual citizens had volunteered for the SOE. The communist FTP often complained that they were being starved of arms by the BCRA, with Charles Tillon noting that the BCRA had organized hundreds of supply drops, of which only 6 were for the FTP. 151. The spring of 1944 is remembered in France as time of the Mentalité terrible, the period of la guerre franco-française, when the milice and the Maquis fought one another without mercy. 152. The milice and Maquis were caught up in ever-escalating cycle of violence, with Ausby commenting, 1944 had simply become the time for settling scores, any scores, for revenging grudges, any grudges. Agreed on this common imperative, the sides in the conflict blur and become almost indistinguishable from each other. The milice hit squads pretended to be the Maquis hit squads pretended to be the milice. Sometimes it was impossible to tell which was really which, and sometimes it hardly mattered. 153. As it was starting to become more and more clear that the Allies were going to win the war, the milice become more desperate and vicious, as the knowledge that, when the Allies won, the militians would be tried for treason if they were not killed first. This caused the milice to engage in increasingly savage torture and killings of the Maquisards. They hoped that they could annihilate all of their enemies before the Allies won. 154. For their part, some of the Maquisards struck back in kind against the milice. In the town of Voiron, close to Grenoble, in April 1944, a Maquis assassination squad entered the home of the local milice chief and killed him, his wife, their infant daughter, their 10-year-old son, and his 82-year-old mother. 154. outside the village of Saint Laurent in the Haute-Save. A mass grave was discovered in May 1944 of 8 gendarmes known for their loyalty to Vichy, kidnapped by the Maquis from Bonneville, who had been lined up and shot by their captors. 154. The killing of the gendarmes was denounced by the chief collaborationist propagandist Philippe Henriot on the radio as the French Caton, who used the killings as an example of the sort of Bolshevik terrorism that he maintained was typical of the resistance. 154. In the south of France, the Maquis had started to form an alternative government to Vichy, which still controlled the French civil service. 138. Georges Guingouin, the communist Maquis leader of the Maquis du Limousin in the Limousin region, styled himself a préfet and imposed his own system of rationing on the local farmers that flouted the rationing system imposed by Vichy. 138. In the Auxois region, the Maquis Bernard had created its system of taxation, with people being taxed on the basis of their willingness to collaborate with the authorities or support the resistance. 138. When the British philosopher A.J. Ayer arrived in Gascony as a SOE agent in the spring of 1944. He described a power structure established by the Maquis that placed power in the hands of a series of feudal lords whose power and influence were strangely similar to that of their 15th-century Gascon counterparts. 138. Reflecting their weakening power, the authorities grew harsher in their punishments. At the village of Ask, close to Lille, 86 people were killed in the Ask massacre on April 1, 1944, by the 12th Waffen-SS Division, Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth. This massacre was committed in reprisal for resistance attacks on the railroads, the first of many villages martyriades of 1944. 155. Starting on May 20, 1944, there occurred another major clash between the Germans and the Maquis at Montmauchet when the Maquis seized another redoubt, which led to overwhelming force being brought to bear against them. 156. Émile Couloudin, the chief of the FFI in the Auvergne, believed that continuing inaction was bad for morale, and starting on May 20, 1944, began to concentrate the Maquis at Montmauchet under the slogan, "Free France starts here." At Montmauchet, he gathered about 2,700 men, who formed the Maquis du Montmauchet. 157 German attacks forced the resistance off Montmauchet by June, killing about 125 Maquisards and wounding about another 125, with the rest escaping. 157. The Germans burned down several small villages in the Montmauchet region and executed 70 peasants suspected of aiding the Maquis. 158. The resistance answered by waging a ferocious guerrilla war against the Germans. Until the end of May 1944, chief clarification needed. Had a block planning policy for the resistance under which the resistance would lie low until Operation Overlord was launched, and then afterwards. The resistance was to launch a full-blown guerrilla war in all of the French provinces one by one. 159. At the end of May 1944, Eisenhower changed his plans and instead wanted a nationwide guerrilla war launched in all of the regions of France with the start of Overlord. 159. The SOE had informed the resistance leaders to listen to the BBC's personal messages, French language broadcasts on the 1st, 2nd, 15th and 16th of every month for the messages telling them when Overlord was due to start. 159. If the phrase "El heure des combats viendra," the hour of battle will come, which was broadcast on 1 June 1944. That was the signal that the Allies would land within the next 15 days. 159. If a line from a poem by Verlaine, "Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne," the long sobs of the violins of autumn, was read on the BBC, that was the signal that the invasion was imminent. And if the following verse, "Blessant mon cœur d'une langueur monotone," wound my heart with a monotonous languor, which was broadcast on 5 June 1944, Then the invasion would occur the next day, 160. In the spring of 1944, a number of uniformed American, French and British soldiers known as the Jedburgh teams, as part of Operation Jedburgh, were landed in France to make contact with the Maquis guerrillas. 161. A Jedburgh team was a three-man crew consisting of a commander, his deputy, and a radio